if you were a Jew and the Nazis were able to get you as an individual, they took away everything that belonged to you. They kicked you out. If you were in an apartment building, they kicked you out of an apartment building. If you had a property, they took it away from you. If you had a store, they ransacked the store and closed it and gave it to some other person.
Wars have plagued America's history generation after generation. One of the most deadly and eye-opening wars was World War II. The Great War, as it was called, was and still is the most widespread conflict in history. A death toll of tens of millions, including 300,000 American soldiers, eradicated once and for all the romantic notion around war. Wars became a gruesome confrontation for world domination and ideological supremacy. The war was between the Axis and Allied powers. The Axis consisted of Japan, Germany, and Italy against the Allies, America, Russia, and England. While the US and Great Britain fought for democracy, the Axis powers fought primarily to maintain and expand their fascist views. The world was put on hold because of this gigantic conflict between the world's superpowers. One country in particular took the world's violence to an entirely different level. Nazi Germany became infamous for its use of concentration camps in the Holocaust. The Holocaust was engineered by the German Third Reich and started in 1938, spanning until the end of the war in 1945. The Holocaust began with persecution of Jews in Germany and escalated to deaths of approximately 6 million Jews in ghettos and death camps. Led by Chancellor of Germany Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party invaded many neighboring European countries such as Czechoslovakia, Austria, France, Poland, Belgium, Netherlands, Greece, Italy, present-day Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia, and part of the Soviet Union. For nearly all targeted citizens of these invaded countries, everyday life was forever changed. Jews, homosexuals, and people with disabilities were sought out for roundups that would ultimately lead to their extermination. When Nazi forces would invade a country, they would begin by taking over all Jewish-owned homes, stores, and other property, and remove the Jews from the rest of the pure Aryan society. First, removing them from their schools and places of work, then moving them to ghettos, and eventually moving them to concentration and death camps such as Auschwitz in Poland, Bergen-Belsen in Germany, Treblinka in Poland, and Dachau.
This persecution and dehumanization of Jews is exemplified in the story of Eric Sharton. Eric represents one of the many millions of Jews whose life was forever changed by the Nazis' reign of power. Eric was born on March 27, 1925, in Vienna, Austria. Austria was the only other German-speaking country in Europe. In Austria, some people believed it was best to join the Nazis when Hitler attained power, since Austria was much smaller than Germany. However, this support was contradicted by opposition from Jews and foreign citizens who would be targeted by the Aryan Nazis. In 1938, Hitler set his sights on the small country of Austria. The Chancellor of Austria at the time was Kurt von Schuschnigg, who was called to meet with Hitler and 3 of his officers to speak about the Austro-German border. Hitler bombarded Schuschnigg with accusations of treason and use of policies in some way were hurting Germany. Such accusations had no actual backing, but Schuschnigg knew that speaking against Hitler would end in the conquest and destruction of his country. Hitler continued to threaten Schuschnigg, saying that Austria would pose no competition to a Nazi invasion and that no other country would come to Austria's aid because they were isolated diplomatically. Germany's foreign minister, Ribbentrop, then gave Schuschnigg a 2-page document stating Hitler's demands, which included the following: all Nazis jailed in Austria were to be set free, ban against the Nazi Party was to be lifted, and Nazi supporters and officials who were put into high government positions in Austria. The conquering of Austria marked the Nazis' second annexation of European countries after the Sudetenland. Almost immediately after the Nazis annexed Austria, everyday life was changed for Jews and other minority groups who were targeted by the Nazis. At the age of 13, Eric attended a well-respected elite private school called the Gymnasium, which was located in Vienna. After Hitler came, quote, "I was kicked out of the Gymnasium, which was a higher level school, and forced to go to the regular level school," end quote. As Eric was being moved to an inferior school, his father was doing everything he could to get the family out of Austria. Eric's father had heard warnings of the Nazis from the Swiss when he went on a business trip to Switzerland in early 1938. On November 9th, 1938, Nazi troops went up and down the streets of Vienna, smashing the windows of Jewish-owned stores and houses and set them ablaze. This night became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. On this same evening, Eric's father Felix walked through the square where the Jews were made to scrub the sidewalk with toothbrushes. Fortunately for him, he looked very Aryan and he had blonde hair and blue eyes, so the Nazi soldiers assumed he was not a Jew and waved him away. This event further convinced Felix and his family that Austria was no longer safe, so they decided that it was time to leave Austria for good.
For many Jews living in countries occupied by the Nazis, the question of where to flee was a major concern. Luckily for Eric and his family, his uncle Herman was involved in importing raw materials from India to European countries such as Austria. He was an international businessman who traveled often for work. When the Nazis came to Austria, Herman and his wife moved to England to avoid the control of the Third Reich. So when the time came for Eric and his family to flee, Herman was able to offer support for them to come to England, whereas most Jews were not able to leave the country because they did not have a sponsor in another country. In March of 1939, just 1 year after the annexation of Austria into the Third Reich, Eric and his family went to England. There, he was educated at a private school in a small town called Lytham St. Anne's, located in Lancashire, which is in the northwest corner of England. Shortly after arriving in England, the Germans invaded Poland in early September of 1939. That is when Eric's father decided that it was time for the family to, quote, get the hell out of Europe because the Nazis were too powerful. At this time, the Nazis now occupied and controlled a large portion of Europe and were still continuing to grow, and the threat that they may eventually invade England was real. Eric's father made every attempt to make it possible for them to get out, and in order to do that, a visa was needed to get to the United States. Visas were only given by the United States if the individual had an affidavit guarantee from somebody on their behalf, which stated that the individual would not be a burden on the state. Fairly easily, Eric's father was able to get an affidavit from his cousin. However, his cousin did not have enough money to get affidavits for 3 people. Desperate to get to the United States, Eric's father found a man in California to give him an affidavit, a person whom he had never met before. Finally, after the family acquired all 3 affidavits, they prepared to journey across the Atlantic to the United States.
During World War II, many British and other European countries' ships were sunk by German U-boats. Not only military ships, but many passenger ships were sunk as well. The Nazis believed that these passenger ships could be secretly laden with all kinds of ammunition and supplies for the anti-Nazi war effort, and therefore began to sink many ships that were solely labeled as passenger ships. At the beginning of the war, many international passengers were afraid to travel on these passenger ships because of the constant threat of attack from German subs. Eric's father was amongst the many people who believed that they would only truly be safe crossing the Atlantic on none other than an American ship. The Nazis did not attack American ships at the time because they were not at war with the United States and therefore felt little need to attack the superpower. However, this arrangement lasted until December 11, 1941, when Germany declared war on the United States, just 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Eric and his family departed from England on the USS President Harding. Most steam ships at the time, like the Harding, were named after U.S. presidents. In October of 1939, Eric and his family arrived in New York about a month after the war had started, 2 days after the Nazi invasion of Poland. Once in New York, Eric's father decided to move the family out of New York and west to Chicago to escape the vast numbers of refugees who had arrived from Europe. At the time, Chicago was split into 2 parts, North and South Chicago. North Chicago was more wealthy and less diverse, while South Chicago consisted mainly of the lower class and had a large African American population. This concentration of African Americans was caused by the Great Migration that occurred during the war because of the increase in job opportunities left behind by those who were drafted. The need for factories to produce more war materials and more food for soldiers caused factory owners to resort to the south of the United States for their workforce. Eric's family settled into an apartment in North Chicago, and Eric began his education at Nicholas Senn High School, located in northern Chicago.
Eric attended Nicholas Senn for only 3 years before graduating a year early, ranking third in his class. Quote, I had gone to school in Vienna, and they felt I had had enough education that 3 years would bring me up to par. The next year, Eric enrolled and began classes at the University of Chicago. 4 years later, he graduated, earning a BS in chemistry and a BA in philosophy. Shortly after graduation, Eric also began medical school at the University of Chicago, graduating fourth in his class. He later moved to Boston, where he married and became a physician at Beth Israel Hospital. After Germany and Japan surrendered, life was still far from normal for Eric and other Jewish families, for now they needed to adjust to their new environments. The war displaced millions of Jews and other citizens of Europe that wanted to get away from the Nazis. This mass migration is exemplified in Eric's story, and the insight he gives sheds a light on the complexities and hardships of Jewish life during and after the war. World War II survivors are now few and far between. The story of Eric and the story of many others must be preserved and retold to future generations to make sure no such destruction nor tragedy occurs again.
I just don't want to say, I just can't deny, make me feel this way. As far as it goes, I reckon you're bad news. What good is a blues, man?